and um, and welcome everyone to this panel on ME, CFS, myalgic encephalomyelitis. Um, my name is David Esteban. I'm an associate professor of biology at Vassar College. I'm also the director of the Science, Technology, and Society program. So let me give you a little bit of a sort of introduction to what we're going to do here and how this is going to work. First of all, if you're attending, you can see us, but we can't see you. But you will have an opportunity to ask questions. And at the bottom of your screen, there should be a little icon that says Q&A. You'll be able to submit your questions. When we get to the Q&A portion of the panel, you can submit your questions there, and there'll be two people that will be looking at those questions and will read them out loud to the panelists. We have three panelists today, MK Flynn, Dr. Susan Levine, and Lynn Esteban. And I want to thank all of you for joining us here today to share your perspectives and your expertise. They'll get, each of our panelists will have some time to talk and will be introduced more fully. But in addition, we'll also have a few presentations from some of the students in my class before we get to the panelists. So let me tell you a little bit about myself and this class first. So I'm a microbiologist with a background in virology and immunology, and more recently, uh-oh, I'm getting an echo. MK and Dr. Levine, can you mute your microphones just so we don't get feedback? Thank you. I'm a microbiologist with a background in virology and immunology, and more recently, an interest in the microbiome, and especially the connection between the microbiome and the brain. My perspective on ME is multiple. As a scientist, this disease, which is often triggered by viral infection, with then systemic immunological and neurological complications, presents, I think, an enormous scientific challenge. As a teacher, looking at the historical, social, political, and biological factors that have shaped our current perspective on ME and our understanding or lack of understanding of ME allows students to explore the determinants of health from diverse perspectives. And as a caregiver, I came to know this disease because it struck someone close to me who you're obviously going to meet in the panel a little bit later. Although I've introduced ME in my classes for several years, this is actually the first year that I've taught a class specifically about ME. In our exploration of the disease, it's really been revealing and really a wonderful experience to hear the insights that my students have had about the disease and the topics that we've read about and discussed. Our final project for the class was to organize an event to educate and inform people about ME outside of our class. And obviously our plans changed partway through the semester, and so we're having this virtual panel today. This was a team effort putting this panel together, so I want to acknowledge the students in my class for their hard work and their enthusiasm in bringing this together and in our class throughout the semester. They are Sue Beck, Emily Howell, Nate Kim, Dea Oviedo Vasquez, Fiona Madden, Sydney Nemphos, Sabrina Perry, Sarah Shirodkar, Niharika Shukla, and Victoria Wilk. Thank you all for being here today and for helping out in this class throughout the year. We've also had several guests in our class and folks that have sort of helped as we developed our ideas for how to put on this event. Terry Wilder at ME Action, Rivka Solomon and Charmaine Proskauer at Massachusetts ME CFS and Fibromyalgia Association, Gabriel San Emeterio, and Hannah Bolus at ME Action. So thank you to all of you. So before we get to the panelists, we'll have a few words from some of my students. And I think we're gonna start off with Dea and Nate. Are you guys ready to go? You should be able to unmute.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Espan. And my name is Nate Kim, and I'm a senior biology major. And with my classmate, Dea.
Yeah, I'm Dea. I'm also a senior STS major.
And together we conducted an online interview with an ME patient named Gabriel to learn more about his experience. And I personally learned a lot from our interview. As an aspiring physician, delivering quality healthcare to patients is essential. And I believe through this interview, I gained a greater understanding of what this means. And yeah, this experience was truly indispensable.
Yeah, I think for me personally, learning about Gabriel's experiences and sort of connecting it with what I've learned about other people with chronic illness or with a disability going through the any kind of medical process, learning more about how those experiences became a sort of trauma that weighed even more on Gabriel's experience with ME, because it wasn't just having to deal with an illness and all of the physical symptoms that came along with it. It was also the constant invalidation and almost like psychological abuse at sometimes that doctors and these people in positions of power were kind of minimizing the struggles that he was living in. And I think being able to talk through that and learn more about that as and potentially share that with you all in a podcast is really something that I really valued from that experience.
And to anyone who's interested in listening to the interview, we will be sharing the link via email to everyone who's RSVP to this event. And you can feel free to share it with anyone you'd like.
Thanks, Nate and Dea. So next we are going to hear from, I think, Sydney, you're next.
Yes, I am next. Hi everyone, my name is Sydney Nemphis and I am a senior biology and English double major at Vassar. And so something that Nate and Dea touched briefly on is the fact that ME/CFS isn't really talked about in like medical settings, particularly in medical school. So I'm going to be touching briefly on how healthcare providers can get CME credit by watching Unrest, which is something I think we as a class think is really important. ME Action has partnered with the American Medical Women's Association and the Indiana University School of Medicine to provide CME credit for healthcare providers who watch Unrest. And it's really easy for anyone to register. You just have to go to the Unrest website, find the link. You click a link saying getting started and they'll send you a code to watch the film. And then after that, you just have to watch a 10-minute video on how to diagnose and manage ME. And then you take an online test and you can receive up to 2 CME credits for watching Unrest. So it's a really, really easy process that healthcare providers should take advantage of.
Great, thank you. And I know from the RSVPs that there are some healthcare providers in attendance today. So Niharika, I think you're next.
Yes. So my name is Niharika. I'm a neuroscience and biochemistry major, and I'm also an EMT and the captain of our college EMS agency. So Sydney has talked about a few ways the healthcare providers can get CME credit. I also wanted to add that if you are a National Registry EMT, you can get CME credit through our agency. So if you're interested in that, please email Victoria Wilk at VWILK@vassar.edu for more information. And I want to talk a little bit about my experience as an EMT in watching this film, since it's made it very clear that the limitations that exist in our healthcare system and the gaps in the training that we receive. And though, of course, all healthcare providers mean well, I think we struggle with invisible illnesses, especially those which we do not yet completely understand the mechanism behind. This film has taught me about an illness I was not exposed to anywhere else, not in my neuroscience classes, and definitely not in my EMT training. And it has reinforced the need for empathy and understanding from all levels of healthcare providers. I hope to take what I've learned and use it in my current practice, and also bring it with me to medical and graduate school, and hopefully as a future career as a physician scientist. Thank you.
Thank you. Next we'll hear from Sue.
Hello, my name is Sue. I'm an STS major, and I wanted to talk about some of the small projects we did throughout this semester. So each of us did like a small project, either individually or as partners. So Nate and Daya's interview was one of those projects. And what I really liked about these projects was seeing the academic backgrounds and the interest behind each of my classmates' project topics. It kind of reflected really well on how the class was offered in both the biology department and the STS department, which is a multidisciplinary department, where you can explore a lot of different departments and disciplines. I learned a lot about ME CFS through these projects, from topics I myself wouldn't have thought of researching and connecting to the condition. And like, even though ME CFS isn't well known in the medical field, that doesn't mean it shouldn't be the same amount of effort or we should still continue learning more about ME CFS outside of the medical field. So like some of the project or topics that people presented on were like racial disparities or like gender differences, seeing how ME CFS is shown to be much more prevalent among women. And we also learned about how people with ME CFS navigate health insurance or the healthcare system, given the lack of knowledge surrounding the conditions, even in the medical field. And then especially with like more biological fields where I'm not as well versed in, we learned about like the neurological or neurobiological side of ME CFS, which was also very important in learning about, and how that how we learn more through these and how we connect it to other social factors to get a more well-rounded information and idea of ME CFS.
Great, thank you. And thanks to all my students who've contributed to our discussions in the course and sort of offered their thoughts here for us. So next we're going to turn to our three panelists and to introduce, actually I should mention, if you're unfamiliar with Zoom, there is a button at the top on my screen at the top right where you can arrange your view to either show a grid that has everyone or speaker view, so that whoever's speaking is the main person on your screen. So feel free to adjust that if you want to get a bigger picture of the person who's speaking. You can put it on speaker view. So to introduce our first panelist, Victoria Wilk will give a brief introduction.
Hello, I'm Victoria. I am a senior biochemistry major at Vassar College. And today I'm honored to introduce one of our panelists and speakers, Lynn Esteban. Lynn Esteban is a creative, artistic, driven person that puts all of her talents towards bettering her community around Poughkeepsie, New York. She went to Fontbonne University, a liberal arts college in St. Louis, and majored in painting. At home, she has a husband, 2 kids, and a very cute dog. And while she met her husband while she was healthy, her kids are not old enough to remember her ever being well. In 2011, she was infected with the Epstein-Barr virus, also known as mono, and triggered her ME, which now fluctuates from moderate to severe. After over a decade as a professional artist, she started a landscaping company in 2011 and a jewelry making business in 2013, but eventually stopped working due to her health. With her limited energy, she has chosen to prioritize being present for her family and do volunteer work from home. Lynn is a part of various volunteer groups and manages to make a huge difference in her community while balancing her own health. In 2019, she testified in a hearing on the New York Health Act for New York State Senate and Assembly Joint Health Committee about her experiences with healthcare as a person with ME. She also spearheaded a local postcard effort modeled after Postcards to Voters that feature intricate personal handmade postcards urging voters to go out and vote. She got Vassar college students, neighbors, and friends involved and ended up sending 8,000 unique postcards for this project. Today, she is continuing to make a difference in her community by sewing masks for healthcare personnel and first responders. Lynn continues to volunteer for ME Action and lends her voice to the ME community.
Thanks, Victoria. I'm super nervous. Let's see. And okay, here we go. So thanks for having me here, everyone. You might have noticed that I have the same last name as Professor Esteban. That is not a coincidence. I am his wife and family member. So we all have me to thank for him getting interested in ME. I rewatched Unrest the other day just to refresh my memory. It was the second time I've seen it. The first time I watched it was soon after it was released, and it had a profound effect on me and on the course of my illness and my life. I was diagnosed in 2011 and with mono. And then when I didn't get well again, I just kept working because everybody said, you'll be fine in 6 weeks, you'll be fine in 2 months. And by that summer, working as a landscaper in a one-person company for the most part, I was slinging mulch and running the intellectual side of the business and the creative side of the business and all of that. And I crashed again. And, I often say I haven't been the same since. That was about 6 months after my initial illness. I just kept pushing. And I just really thought I would get better if I, everybody says if you just exercise or you just keep going. And that's really kind of a cultural way that we have of looking at most problems. And then once I didn't get well again, I was sort of diagnosed with with mono again, but then I started going to specialists, and it all sounds very familiar. Unrest, there were a lot of experiences in Unrest that just were like uncannily similar to mine. I think Jen went to specialists a lot more quickly and more, more rapid fire, one against another. First I was diagnosed with lupus, and I remember my first reaction when I got the lupus diagnosis was, thank God it's not fibro or chronic fatigue, because no one would believe me if I had those. And, joke's on me a little bit. It's really, it's wild to think back, and lupus is a really serious disease that destroys your organ systems, and that I would be happier to have that, just because I knew people would believe me. It's like I already knew about the stigma. So yeah, anyway, that, I didn't get better with those treatments. And then I went to another doctor, and then I went to another doctor, and, all the specialties that we could think of. And we really were sort of sticking close to home and more sort of suburban doctors. And not, I didn't know that you should look for someone who specializes in exactly what's wrong with you, and that makes a big difference. And I didn't know that you couldn't just go to any neurologist or any rheumatologist. And those sorts of lessons, not only do they take years to learn, because you go to a doctor and they give you the blood work and it takes 6 weeks to get back, and then you go back to them, and these whole processes, it's months of your life at a time that are just chipping away while you're waiting and waiting. But one of the things that Unrest really, really changed for me was realizing that, having accepted my illness was one thing, but that there's a balance between accepting it and still fighting for wellness. And so I ended up realizing through the film that that there were sort of communities online that I could find that weren't, boy, there's a lot of information online, and it's really hard for anybody to filter through it. But for someone with ME, I get overwhelmed so quickly. There's just no way, if somebody says celery juice, and I don't know if that's any more reputable than chiropractic, than mold illness, than, it's like all of these things that might actually help are mixed in with a whole bunch of quackery and woo and stuff that doesn't. And so I sort of figured out through the film that I would be able to connect with this community of people that had an understanding of the disease from a scientific perspective, at least as well as we can have at this time. And that really set into motion a drastic improvement in my health, because I started to get advice about how to manage my own crashes, and how to monitor my heart rate, and how to, things that you don't learn from doctors, how to manage your lifestyle, and just sort of live within these new parameters. I was a very energetic person before, and it took a lot of grief and pain and hard lessons to get to the point where I have to have a less energetic life, and I have to behave very differently. We joke that I'm Lynn 2.0 now, on the other side of this illness. I think, there were a lot of things that, like I said, that I identified with in the film, but especially with, things about relationships between Jen and Omar, or with, I forget her name, Luann or Leanne, the mother, experiences with parenting when you have ME. My kids were 1 and 5, I think, they're thereabouts when I got sick. And, we just bought a house, and David was pre-tenure, and, things were bananas on a lot of levels. And it was like the worst possible time I could imagine for me to be sidelined. And so through time, I guess, I sort of tried to think about what messages I wanted to leave everyone with, because the film covers so well, the symptoms and grief and pain and a lot of the difficult parts of it. But I wanted to talk about sort of once I moved past that initial, there was a nuclear bomb in my life and everything changed, and I had to grieve all of that. But now on the other side of it, I have this other life that is a really happy, fulfilling life. And even though ME sucks and it's awful, I still can have a happy life. And it's just, everything is so much smaller. So, one of the things that happens is that, your priorities are all, the things that are the very most important to you are all that's left, because you deal in sort of micro amounts of energy. And so if all you have is 10 minutes of energy a day, what are you going to spend it on? Are you going to talk to your kids, or are you going to shower? It, it it's hard to understand until you've been there, that those kinds of decisions. But it's funny, because sometimes I look back, I was in my early 30s when I got sick, and sometimes I think, gosh, I was so young. And other times I think, I feel lucky because I know people who have been sick since they were kids. And so I think I'm so glad that I got to have these experiences before I got sick. What I didn't have was focus. I was an artist, but I didn't really have like this burning drive to have a specific career or a specific path. I'm sort of wandering along happily. And what ME has done is sort of strip away all of those distractions of, oh, maybe I could do this thing or that thing, or this seems interesting. And what's left is my family and well, that's pretty much it. But, once at the end of the day, in order for my own fulfillment, like Victoria talked about, I have these creative projects that I do for, that I volunteer for, and that are often political. And so it's like, I try to find these things that are sort of two birds with one stone, or maybe even more, that I can fulfill my creative side, my political side. I can be an activist. I can work with other people from my bed, trying to find ways that I can do small things that have a huge impact, has been really important to, I don't know, I guess my own fulfillment. So yeah, I didn't have that focus before, and now I have focus, and I have the confidence, and I have the priorities, but I don't have the ability anymore. I don't have the energy. It really is, I think, one of the cruelest things about ME is it strips you down to what you really want, and you can't reach it. And I remain hopeful that I'm gonna, I'm constantly trying new treatments and seeking out new tests and doctors and new ways of looking at the illness. And I'm super lucky that I'm married to a scientist, so he can read papers and go to conferences and come up with new ideas of things. But so I'm hopeful that those treatments are I'd love to go back to work. I'd love to do all of these things in the future. So I've been in places where I didn't have hope, and I've been in really low places, like Jen showed in the movie, and those are bleak and they're awful. And I do my best never to go back there. And one of the big keys I found is to maintain that hope, however small, that I'm going to be able to do something tomorrow, even if not today. So yeah, I try to focus on what I can do as opposed to what I can't. I think that, let's see, making wise choices about what I do. Let's see, I'm just trying to make sure I covered all my little points on my notes here. That yeah, I work on acceptance and making the choice every day to have a great sense of humor and to approach things. Certainly it can be a very dark sense of humor, but I try to approach everything with kindness and generosity, and to have this experience bring out the best in me as opposed to otherwise. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that I might have covered everything I wanted to. Yeah, that might be all. I guess a really big part of it, in hearing some of the students talking about what they learned, it really struck me about, I trusted the doctors to know my body better than I do. And it took me, I don't know if that's just that we're socialized, that, you know, that doctors sort of know everything, and it took having a disease that doctors don't understand for me to realize that they don't, or if it is like a gendered thing or what, but I really believed that they knew, and that if I went in and they said with confidence, this is working for you, that I would just keep pushing. And it took years for me to get to the point where I said, no, this isn't working. I mean, I think it was in the first year of my illness that I asked for a wheelchair, and I had a doctor talk me out of it. And it took like 6 more years. And it has completely changed my life to be able to have a power wheelchair to get places and do things I wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So I think one of the really important things that I wish I could explain to new patients experiencing this is to believe the messages from your body, like listen really carefully. Because like I remember one of my first symptoms was air hunger, like not being able to get a full deep breath. And I went to so many pulmonologists and cardiologists, and they couldn't figure it out. And like, I still don't understand what the mechanism is, but what I've learned over the years is it's one of the first signs that I need to lay down. So, you know, all the doctors, while they were doing all of their tests that said I was perfectly healthy, what I needed was rest. And that's what my body was telling me to do. And I just had to learn to listen to those signs that changed overnight. So I guess that's one of the main messages that that kind of gets lost in our culture, because you think, oh, well, I have a cold, so the doctor says to do this, or I broke a bone, we know what to do for that. But in the end, the people who know what to do with ME, other than a select few doctors, one of whom we're lucky to have here today, but the people who really know are the patient community. And those are the people to lean on and to talk to and to learn from, is listen to yourself and listen to the patient community. So thank you for having me here today, and I look forward to hearing from everyone and answering any questions that I might have brought up with people. So thanks.
Thanks, Lynn. Next we'll have Fiona to introduce Dr. Levine.
Hello. First, I want to say thank you so much, Lynn, for joining our panel and for sharing your story with us today. Another panelist we have joining us is Dr. Susan Levine. Dr. Levine began seeing patients with chronic fatigue while completing her second fellowship in immunology at Mount Sinai Medical Center. Through her clinical work, Dr. Levine has contributed important data to the NIH's Centers of Excellence for ME/CFS research. She is also currently working with Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health, as well as Cornell's Center for Enervating Disorders, to uncover markers that will help to characterize ME/CFS and spur clinical trials. Dr. Levine is also a part of the Bateman Horn Center Clinician Summit, which meets annually to discuss patients' needs and ways to improve their quality of life. As a member and chairperson of the Federal Advisory Committee for CFS, Dr. Levine has also been at the forefront of advocacy for patients and policy issues related to ME/CFS. Her clinical focus is on developing tools to help her patients find relief of their symptoms in their day-to-day life, provide medical education for the next generation of doctors and medical professionals, and to drive this illness into the mainstream medical community. Thank you, Dr. Levine, for taking the time to be here with us virtually.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. You guys, am I on? Okay, let me say a few words. Thank you for that very nice introduction. And I loved some of the stories in the work, hearing about the work that your medical students conducted. I was surprised to learn that we could introduce discussions about ME, and I'm very pleased to hear that as early as undergraduate years, because I think that's really going to spur interest in pursuing this field, as a lot of your students probably go on to med school or to study biology or neurobiology. And I think I heard I jotted down some key words that I heard from other people that spoke before me. Clinician, physician, scientist. Now, I think this illness does attract doctors and other health professionals who have one foot in the door of curiosity and learning mysteries and solving mysteries, and have an interest in science and scientific mechanisms. And then having empathy for the patient, and as Lynn said, very clearly listening to the patient, and that's key here. I think the combination of those two traits in a physician will make for a very good ME/CFS clinician. A lot of doctors are satisfied with seeing a patient, and not just satisfied, but feel more comfortable seeing a patient, being able to come up with the diagnosis right away, and having a ready fire treatment. That's not the case with ME, and 30 years into the disease, I'm the first one to say that. So I think the doctor has to step back and kind of keep listening to the patient and be patient in terms of, going for more tests and trying different treatments out. He did have a bit of an agenda, and I won't take too long about it. In the introduction, it was mentioned that I was part of this Cindy Bateman Horn Clinicians Center. Now, she has an annual summit, and this year, of course, it was carried out virtually, and there are about 40 clinicians that meet, and we have developed, hopefully, a system to try to educate new doctors, and it's based on an echo system that was used in New Mexico to teach doctors in rural and underserved areas about hepatitis C. And so what it does is each of us are going to take turns talking about an aspect of ME/CFS, and we're going to try to draw an audience of doctors who might be interested in hopefully also get CME credits, and give a short lecture on an aspect of ME, for instance, orthostatic, I don't want to get too technical, orthostatic intolerance, that condition where a lot of the patients have difficulty standing without having a rapid heart rate. And then they would also bring questions about their own patients to that meeting, that virtual meeting. And so as I said, we would rotate among the different clinicians in our group to give lectures about different topics, and they would be posted online. That's a very important provider education, I think, is one of the top priorities of our group. Additionally, we want to approach medical school deans about introducing it in the curriculum, because right now it is not in the curriculum at all. And even in residency programs, having grand rounds meetings about it. I think this is the only way that we're going to pass the knowledge of us older, soon-to-be retired clinicians to the new generation of clinicians. As I said, I think it's fabulous, this idea of introducing it at the level of college, where you have a little bit of perspective and time to look at also, as David mentioned, the political ramifications, the social ramifications, cultural, anthropological. There's all these aspects of it that I think we don't talk about much as doctors because it's not sort of science, quote unquote, but I think it's very important, and it was alluded to a few times here. Other words that were mentioned by previous speakers: invisible illness, right? Everybody looks okay, and so oftentimes you get passed over by clinicians. And trauma. I think the illness is extremely traumatic, and that word should not be lost. It's a very serious disorder. I'm going to just very briefly touch on the fact that the way we now diagnose chronic fatigue syndrome, or at least I do in a sort of a bridged time frame, is through 3 key elements. Post-exertional malaise, that is the patient after doing just some minimal activity, quote unquote, crashes either a few hours after that activity or the following day. So that's a key element, post-exertional malaise. cognitive problems, slowed processing of new information in particular. The IQ, or the intelligent level, usually stays the same, but it's the processing speed and the short-term memory that's impaired often in patients with this. Thirdly, unrefreshing sleep. The irony is you're tired, but you're wired. You can't sleep. And of course, that means less energy for daytime activities. That sounds simplistic, but those are three key elements that I feel have to be there. And then along with those are, fancy word, dysautonomia. And that includes the lightheaded dizziness or the POT symptoms, excessive sweating, thermoregulatory problems, problems with gut mobility. Anyway, so those I feel are things that when you ask the patient those things and the answer is yes, then you're like 95% certain that that person has CFS-ME. Of course, you need to still pursue laboratory tests, but those are the clinical elements of the diagnosis. I'm also going to touch very briefly on comorbid disorders. What that means is many patients have not only the key elements that I mentioned of ME/CFS, but they have POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia, or orthostatic intolerance. Again, that feeling that they're going to faint if they just stand in one place very long. And that can be confirmed through various types of tests. Mast cell disorder, which means excessive production of histamine or tryptase, which are mediators from mast cells. And fibromyalgia, which often co-occurs with CFS, and that means that the patient has a predominance of pain and also has a sleep disorder. Frequently, fibromyalgia can mask something called small fiber neuropathy, which has also been increasingly found and means that the central nervous system is being attacked in these patients. And lastly, that I want to talk about today is EDS, or hypermobility, not full-blown Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, but a tendency towards hypermobility in a large percentage of these patients. And the reason it's important to note these things is that a cardiologist, when they see a POTS patient, can say, maybe this patient also has ME/CFS, so they can be diagnosed not only by their primary care doctor, but by specialists in varying fields. So I think it's important to get the word out to these specialty groups. One of the most underserved people, and it's in Jen Brea's film, are those people that are completely homebound. Who looks after them? Can they even get to a doctor? Now, as far as I know, not many doctors do house calls. I think the advent of telemedicine and physicians and other medical providers' comfort level with it, rising comfort level during this COVID pandemic, may actually help reach patients given a willing provider who are severely homebound. Because otherwise I'm really not sure how a lot of patients who are home all the time get any medical care at all. So that's an underserved area that we'd really like to look at. And, I think lastly, because it's obviously the elephant in the room, how will the COVID pandemic impact our ME patients? Not only those who get infected with the virus, how will it alter the genomic, microbiome, metabolomic findings in these patients if they get infected, and or just living through this pandemic? Will that alter patients' symptoms in any way? A lot of patients tell me this is way of life already, being at home, most of the time. So it's not that different, but some of the patients are also telling me that their sleep patterns, headaches, and other symptoms have been worsened just with the stress of being part of this pandemic. I'd like to end on that note and take any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Levine. So now we'll have Emily introduce MK.
All right. Hi, I'm Emily. And Mary Kathleen Flynn is the mother of a teenage daughter with ME, CFS, and POTS. Her daughter became ill 6 years ago at the age of 11, and her condition appears to have been triggered by a virus, most likely Epstein-Barr. Her daughter is now 11, and her condition seems to be improving very slowly over time. She is mostly homebound and attends an online high school. MK will share her experiences taking care of a child with ME/CFS and POTS, including helping her daughter face the challenges of continuing her education, pursuing and developing her interests, and establishing and maintaining friendships through long-term debilitating illness. MK graduated from Vassar College in 1984 with a major in English and has worked as a journalist in magazines, websites, and TV shows. Currently, she serves as the editor-in-chief of Mergers and Acquisitions, a business publication focused on private equity and middle market deal-making. Past positions include on-air reporter at CNN and MSNBC, where she covered technology and the internet. At MSNBC, she often appeared on TV with Omar Wasow, the husband of Unrest documentary producer Jennifer Brea.
As you said, I worked with Omar at MSNBC many years ago. And of course, watching Unrest, he is the person that I identified the most with because he's a caregiver of Jen and I'm a caregiver of my daughter. Some of the other people in the film that I also related to were some of the parents. And of course, David, I relate to you as well in your role with Lynn. So as Emily said, my daughter got sick 6 years ago when she was 11. So she's 17 now. Luckily, she had kind of a classic situation where she had a very high fever for about 11 days and was diagnosed with mono and with bronchitis. She went on antibiotics for the bronchitis, and at the end of that, she still wasn't well. And we were very fortunate in that our pediatrician recognized, very quickly that she should have bounced back after that dose of antibiotics. And so literally within about 3 weeks of her becoming ill, the pediatrician was already using the word fatigue. I looked up again today what the CDC says about how quickly can you diagnose a child with chronic fatigue syndrome, and it's 6 months. So the fact that our pediatrician was using that word at 3 weeks is really remarkable. And I think saved us a lot of the agony of going to many, many doctors and not being understood. We recognized immediately that she was ill and it was physical, and he gave us words early on. So he did diagnose her with ME/CFS, and then she continued not to recover. And after about a year, we went to see a specialist in another state, and that specialist diagnosed her with POTS as well, which Dr. Levine was just talking about. And POTS is a form of dysautonomia. So in her case, standing up and then perhaps a few moments later, becoming very dizzy and falling down was, kind of how the POTS manifests itself. A big challenge was how to continue her education. In most states, it's the law that you have to attend school, so that's not really an option. And we tried many, many different educational models, one-on-one tutorials. She had been in a public school in an accelerated program, so it became clear she wouldn't be able to continue that program. So we tried tutoring. We tried, at one point we went to a rural environment and she was enrolled in a small private school. But each time we tried a different educational model, it became clear that she was not well enough to attend school. And one of the big lessons that I want to pass on that I've learned and I think Lynn touched on this and Dr. Levine touched on this as well, is that we really need to listen to the person who has the illness, and we need to follow that person's lead. And I'll say with my daughter, in the case of education, that was one of the ways that I learned the importance of following her lead, because from the beginning, she had said that she thought that going to school online was what would be the best thing for her. And we insisted on trying every other model first, but ultimately going online was the right model for her, and really the only one, because by being educated through distance learning and through the internet, she's able to, or she's enrolled in a school where she can go at her own pace. They have her online school has a medical enrollment, so she doesn't get penalized if it takes her longer than the semester or the year to finish a course. So that was a really good example where I wish we'd followed her lead earlier. When I told her this morning that I was going to pass on this lesson of following her lead, she also said, that while she has a very strong personality and is very vocal about what she needs, she cautioned me that not everybody is. So I think, Lynn, you were talking about the importance of listening to your own body. I think as caregivers, we need to help remind the person with the illness to listen to themselves and to help advocate for them. I mentioned today my daughter's 17. She has some very strong passions and interests that include writing and art and photography and filmmaking and video editing. So like Lynn, my daughter's a very creative person. I think that has been her godsend. We've talked a lot about things like art therapy. I think about the author Laura Hildenbrand, who wrote Seabiscuit. She's a good role model. I think Jennifer Brea is a good role model. Learning to do creative things from home and things that don't have a specific deadline have been very powerful. And my daughter also does a lot of things with her hands. So whenever she was the sickest, I knew she was starting to turn a corner if she could sort of sit up a little bit and do some hand sewing. And I really am thankful for that elementary school teacher who taught her how to sew in an after school class. The other thing in talking to her this morning about what would be helpful for all of you to know, she talked about how technology is your friend. I know there's a lot of the internet gets a bum rap when it comes to teenagers a lot, and social media, and a lot of parents are concerned about that. But for my daughter, the internet and social media have really been a saving grace. And through, in particular, Instagram, she's able to share her art and her creative work, but she's also able to connect with a whole community of artists and learn from them. Whether it be YouTube videos or following someone else's Instagram account and kind of reverse engineering what they're doing with their artwork. And then also becoming friends through Instagram and friends through shared interests. One thing she does is to collaborate with other video editors on videos that they produce together, and they can do that, over the internet. Tumblr, I know, is another site that's helpful for this, but in her case, she's used Instagram a lot. I guess another thing in this theme of following the lead of the person who is suffering from the illness, I think of a friend of mine who is the founder of a middle school and high school, and he always tells me that he likes to talk about parenting the child in front of you, and I think that's really important for family members who are living with someone with a chronic illness, that you really need to see the person for where they are today, and that can change moment to moment. I mean, we saw in Unrest, one minute Jen was dancing with Omar, and the next minute she's on the ground. So that energy can change so quickly. And Lynn talked a lot about really taking advantage of those moments when the energy is there, and also being very careful about what you spend it on and making sure that it's the most important thing. And so I would encourage parents and other caregivers to think about that too. So for example, you know, we made, and luckily again, at the advice of the doctors that we were seeing, we made socializing with her peers to be a priority. And really anything that gives her joy is much more important than doing something that, some tedious task, or something like wasting time, you know, taking the subway or wasting energy or something like that on something like public transportation. If we can get her to someplace quickly so that she can, what energy the new, can you, can you hear me?
MK, I think we lost you.
Okay, I'm still here. Can you hear me at all?
We can hear you now. You
Okay.
froze for a moment.
Sorry about that. Yeah, the internet. Well, I'm not sure where I stopped broadcasting, so to speak. I was talking about the new normal and how important it is for family members to accept the new normal. And I think, and Lynn, I think you talked about this too, but the faster that you can kind of adjust to the fact that this is a huge change in the person's life and in the family's life, I think the better off everyone will be. And you know, really focus on things in the moment. And the other thing that my daughter mentioned in the same spirit of the new normal was also understanding that there's a new future and there's a new sense of the future. And you know, you can't assume that the plans that you made in the past are ones that you'll be able to keep in the future. And so she was talking about how
We're losing you again, MK. We lost you for a moment there, but you're back.
Well, I'll just say quickly that my daughter was saying that you have to plan for a new future, and you know, not hang on to the old plan, but rethink the plan for the future. And the end goal might be the same, but how you get there, the path that you take, is going to be different. So I'll end there.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, MK. Thank you, Dr. Levine, and thank you, Lynn. So now we can open it up to questions. So if you have any questions, you can click on the Q&A button and type in your question. And then we'll have two students that will be reading the questions as they come through.
Okay. So we have our first question. For caregivers, how do you sustain and maintain your own well-being over time?
MK, I think that question is for you. Oh, I think MK is frozen.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
So the question was about caregivers and how we take care of ourselves. That's a hard one, I have to say. You know, I think when you're I'm not sure I know how to answer that. I think for me, honestly, taking care of my daughter has been such a high priority and such a fulfilling experience and such a chance to be close to her and intimate with her that you know, taking care of her needs has really become the most important thing to me in the world. And by taking care of her, honestly, it is taking care of me. David, how about you?
Yeah, I guess I'm not officially part of the panel, but I can still answer the question, I guess. Um, I've learned that that even though it feels selfish, doing things for myself is important. And I guess it took time to realize that actually isn't selfish. That for me to be a good caregiver, I also need to be healthy and well, and I can do better at it if I'm doing things that I also enjoy. So finding those things that that give me joy is important.
All right, so next question. So this one's kind of a mouthful, but so it has been brought up that CFS is a misnomer because there are so many other symptoms that the words chronic and fatigue don't cover. I believe it's also called chronic fatigue immune dysfunction syndrome. Can you share your thoughts on naming the disease CFS versus CFIDS?
Maybe that's a good question for Dr. Levine about the naming.
Yeah, well, that's been, I'd say, for the last, as long as I can remember, there have been battles about what it should be called, and I think the latest is probably ME/CFS. The idea being that it does affect the brain. It's clear that there are abnormalities in the brain in people with ME, and some people argue whether does it affect the muscles, myalgic encephalomyelitis, we're not sure. CFIDS is gone a little bit by the wayside, but it's probably more descriptive than CFS per se. I think rightly so that patients object to just fatigue because it doesn't really convey the level of malaise and all the neurological symptoms that are so apparent to us. So, but it's not over yet. I think we still haven't really arrived at the right name. But I'd say most people in this field are now referring to this as ME/CFS.
Okay, so this next question was specifically for Lynn, and it's what gives you hope?
It gives me hope that there is emerging science all the time. David has started going to conferences and coming home with really exciting new findings. The work coming out of Stanford, particularly, Ron Davis and et al. There's just really exciting things that are being found. So that gives me hope that there are treatments on the horizon. I don't know, it can be hard to come by sometimes, I'll admit. And, there's a bit of a fake it till you make it. I think one thing too that gives me hope just in general is just in focusing on smaller things. I think that when I was healthier, it took a lot more to get my hope going. But I live a smaller life now, and so it gives me hope to I don't know, I guess look for the helpers, like Mr. Rogers says, seeing the good in people and seeing the best in people, and really focusing on relationships and on today. I don't know, it really just going back to the simplest ways of making yourself happy, it can bring hope.
All right. This next question is for Dr. Levine. Has funding for ME research increased since Unrest was filmed?
Of course, hard to know. I feel that funding is still lagging for clinical care, I feel that there's a little more funding, still vastly underfunded compared to research for acne, for instance. There's $100 million being given for acne research and, psoriasis, which is not a trivial disease, but because there are drugs available for that. Whereas there are no, big pharma is not involved yet with ME/CFS because we don't have a marker for it. So there's very little funding for that. But I think by comparing the research side of ME/CFS versus the clinical, bolstering it's being taught in med schools and other places and getting the word out there to clinicians, I think that's very much lagged behind. But I think what is going on now and what Professor Esteban mentioned earlier about, I think it's University of Michigan where you're offering CME credit. I mean, I think, using the film as a vehicle and, it's sort of nice to have like lunchtime and have the clinicians sit around and watch the movie. It's kind of more pleasurable than reading in a textbook. And I think will draw clinicians in. So I think in that sense, it's bolstering the visibility, but I'm not sure about funding per se.
Thank you, Dr. Levine. So this next question is from Sarah Garijo-Garde, where she is kind of thinking about that culture of productivity and how it's expected that we're productive members of society and always working. So for those of you who have personal experiences with ME, how have you learned to overcome that stigma? And then for physicians and those who are guiding people through that diagnosis period, how do you give advice or help people reframe?
Wow, I can tackle this one a little bit. This was definitely a stigma I had to overcome within myself. I was even talking earlier to Victoria a little bit when she was getting my bio together. And, I was sort of saying I don't really have a lot to offer. That's wise. I don't have a law degree. I don't make six figures. People in general don't see the kind of wisdom that I've gained through this disease as something worth listening to. And so I've internalized that. It's actually really similar to when my first child was a baby and I wasn't making art yet, and I was still trying to identify who I am as a parent. And I referred to myself as a stay-at-home mom. And people would literally turn their backs on me. Like it's very similar to that. And so, there's a stigma in our culture at identifying as disabled. There's absolutely a stigma to the fact that I don't have a job to put after my name. That's how we encapsulate people. That's how we sort of decide their worth is definitely financial. And what do you offer to our economy and the work that I do is unpaid. So I don't overcome is, man, that's a big ask. It's something I live in every day, living in a capitalist society. But for within myself, my value within my own home is really different than my value when I'm at a cocktail party or something. It comes down to that I'm paying so much attention to what gives me energy and what gives me joy and what gives me good feelings as opposed to draining feelings, that the things that give me joy bring value to my life, and I think therefore bring me value. It's a tough one though. That's one that still sneaks up on me. And, with MK talking about, her daughter redefining her future and how to look at that, that's definitely been something that I've had to confront as well is, the odds I'm ever going to make a whole lot of money are like infinitesimal. And so, my value is in my relationships with other people and in what I can give to my community and in just being the best person that I can be every day.
Thank you. Dr. Levine, do you want to talk a little bit about how you might guide patients through that period?
I totally agree with Lynn, and I see maybe a silver lining in a strange sort of way, not really of being sick, but I think that it's true that our culture does kind of value what you bring to the economy, as you put it very well. But I think what I try to do with patients is to, it kind of sounds like a cliche, but to accept the illness and to look for other things that they might have done had they not gone like right away into their profession, for instance, and take a course online just as a more tangible thing, or spend more time with their kids. And also, I have to say, to try to build in, this is going off topic slightly, but it's suddenly you go from 150%, usually very high energy person, to like 10%. And so what do you do? Like Lynn said, you use that 10 minutes very wisely, but I also try to get people to have their day, let's say maybe a person that doesn't have children, less amorphous. In other words, if you're very tired when you wake up, but give yourself one or two like little goals to do during the day. And I try to say that in a better way than I'm saying it now, but to try to give them just like kind of structure to their day, because that can be kind of depressing not to have like a couple of things, which could mean just sitting up and making dessert, or like a fun type of thing, or watching a program online, or listening to an audiobook, or talking to a friend on Skype for 10 minutes, but just sort of to schedule a little bit during the week, or to have a few things to look forward to, and to not spend the day, for instance, just as an example, like in the bedroom, but to wake up, get dressed, and move to a different room, and then lie on the couch if you need to, that kind of thing. Whatever would suit that individual patient, but to just give them some kind of semblance of quote unquote normal, for lack of a better way of putting that, but just a certain structure, because I find that suddenly people who've been working 60 hours plus, in some cases, suddenly face like an empty room, an empty house, and they just need that structure. So I think I try to convey that with some people.
Awesome. Thank you. Next question is, how can others help those with ME/CFS without having someone close to them with the disease?
I don't know if that's a question for me or not. Some of the best relationships that I have with friends are ones that leave me feeling valued, people who are super flexible, and complimentary is the word that comes to mind, and it's not quite the right one, but people who really value the small amount that I can give, and who make that really known to me repeatedly, that it's okay that I can't quite do enough. Can we do it a different day? Can we do it a different way? Can we, can I bring coffee instead of us meeting out? So there's the interpersonal ways that people can help in friendships. And certainly things like, I'm going to the grocery, can I grab a few things for you? And, obviously we're living in a bit of a modified world right now, but the other way is to get involved with activism. We are so sick and so tired that, something like going and testifying like I did last year, which all in all took a couple of hours, it sidelined me for weeks. So being vocal to your legislators, talking to your doctors and your physician friends about, or other healthcare provider friends about unrest and about this disease. I just think helping us raise the alarm that this is real and it's serious and we need help. Just helping be a voice and raise our voices. It's a great question.
Thank you. So this next question is from Becky, and she says, I'm not sure how to manage my energy. I feel like my muscles get weaker every day, and when I try to do things like laundry, my muscles feel like spaghetti. How do you know how much to push?
I guess I can tackle that a little bit. Um, there aren't enough healthcare providers around who do this, but what I would like to have ideally is maybe about 100 in the city of New York alone, exercise physiologists that can work even remotely with my patients, because I feel that like I said earlier, some kind of structure is important. Doing like an ever so slight amount of exercise in the bed even, and that's different from every person. That's why I would want each of my patients to have their own customized, quote unquote, I wouldn't even say exercise regimen, but movement regimen, to do maybe a couple of minutes 2 or 3 times a day, to perhaps prevent the deconditioning that leads to the spaghetti feeling. I mean, nothing, we really need a cure. That's what we really need. This is just like Scotch tape holding the person together. But I think that people do find it helpful psychologically and maybe in some other ways to do just some minimal amount. And it all ties in with the person's heart rate to make sure that the heart rate doesn't exceed a certain threshold. So that's why I'm saying that it has to be very personalized, patient by patient. But I think, unfortunately, nothing short of a cure is really going to help that feeling.
All right, thank you. This next question is also from Becky, and she says, how do you know when you are better and can return to work? Recently had my longest stretch of good days, which was 2 weeks, and then I crashed badly again. How long would someone have to go to be considered well enough to return to work? Am I being naive to believe I will be able to work again?
Yes, I can, if you don't mind, I'll say a few words on that. So there, obviously, I'm sure what's come out as a result of our talking today is that that ME/CFS is a spectrum, and that, you know, there are people who are completely homebound and never leave their homes. And then there are people who even do work part-time, but that's usually all they do. And I do have a number of patients who are on disability, most of them full-time disability. What I do say to people, and unfortunately this is not successful most of the time, is if you feel sort of a pressure to try to return to work, is to try to simulate literally what it's like to go back, like set your alarm at the time that you would be getting up, take into account what the commute would be like, and literally see if you can be up that amount of hours that it would take. I usually advise, let's say, someone who hasn't been working for 6 months or longer, to see if their employer will allow them certain accommodations. And obviously it depends on the type of work that they were doing. Some people, like teachers, can't have that because it's either all or nothing. But if they can have accommodations, say working from home 2/3 of the time even, and again, maybe because of this crisis, people will get more familiar with the idea of telework, you know, that kind of thing. Because I think the commute in a lot of people's cases is quite draining. But, you know, oftentimes I don't exactly push people, but I try to make them not feel guilty if they feel like maybe they just can't return to work, because if all you're doing is working and then coming home and crashing, that's not a great lifestyle either. But you have to talk to the person a lot about it, because as someone said earlier, that a lot of patients identify with their work, and, you know, there's a great deal of loss and grief when they have to kind of admit to themselves that they can't work at all. So you can't just sort of bluntly tell them like you can't go back to work. You have to, it's kind of a process that you have to talk about a lot.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Libby. That's really good advice. So this next question is for Len, and it is from Caitlin. How do you maintain a happy and strong marriage during all of this?
Ask me right in front of my husband. Well, first of all, hey, David, MK's back, but she can't turn her camera on. If you could help
Oh,
with that.
okay.
Yeah. Um,
Do you want help answering this question?
no, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay.
I think, first of all, I was lucky in that we had a great marriage to start with. And I really never would have thought that there were ways that our marriage could improve before I got sick. We had a really great marriage. But then, along comes Emmy, and with 2 little kids and life happening, man, shit got hard. Excuse me, I cursed. But it got really, really hard. And we had to learn how to say really hard things to each other that I don't think we would have needed to say otherwise. We grieved together, and we communicated about our losses, even when to me, it felt like they were my fault, or that, whatever, just communicating through what's happening. It was almost like there was this third person in our marriage, this really, really bad partner. I'm good and he's good. And then there's Emmy, and it just is the worst marriage partner ever. And so being able for me and David to be a team and Emmy not be my fault was really, really helpful. And before I hand it over to David, in case he has any insights about this too, I want to say that, something that I'm hesitant in the way I talk about it because of the stigma of therapy in Emmy. It is not a cure for Emmy. There is no psychological cure or cause, but it is, like Dr. Levine said, it is traumatic. And going through anything traumatic, especially it's continued trauma, I keep crashing and I keep having trauma. One of the few things I do every week is I go to therapy, and that has helped me immeasurably in my marriage, in being a mother, in growing through this experience, and learning how to identify when I'm starting to spin out of control, because I don't have the energy for that. I really can't, afford to lose my head. And so I really think that therapy helped our marriage too, just my personal therapy, because I brought a lot of those tools back and we worked on them together. And I guess just to finish out, I just want to say that you're in it together. And, the marriages that I've seen fail around us are often ones where the well partner doesn't feel like it's something that's happened to them both. It's something that happened that they can get out of. So we're in this together. And I think that's the most important thing for us to come back to. And David, do you have any insights about being married to me?
You said it much, much better than I could. So I don't think I'll add to it and stumble around it and and make it worse. That was a fabulous answer.
All right, thank you guys. This next question is from Andrew, and they're asking, as a parent with CFS, how should I worry about the hereditary, sorry, I always struggle with that word, potential that my child contracts disease, and how can I best protect and monitor my child's health?
I'm not sure if that's one for me as a parent or for Dr. Levine as a doctor, but we can probably both approach it from different perspectives. There's the practical, getting your kid medical attention immediately if you start to see those signs. But then there's that part in your head that's like, or am I just projecting this onto my kid? Maybe it's normal, maybe it's growing pains, maybe they're just tired, maybe they have the flu. It is hard. And, I really identified with the mother in Unrest who said the worst day of her life was when her daughter was diagnosed. I mean, my kids are 10 and 14. I had to think about it. And so it's scary. It's really, really scary. This is my worst nightmare. And now them having it is my worst nightmare. So I think just making sure that you get the medical attention quickly. And,
instilling in them the fact that you don't have to push yourself. If you are tired, you need to rest. If you do not have the brain to work on your homework right now, that is not the most important thing. You need to rest your brain. Take a brain break. I think that one of the things that worked against me personally was our culture of push yourself, push yourself. And so I'm trying to teach my kids not to do that. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Dr. Levine, you want to take that one as well?
A few words. Yeah, I mean, I do get that quite a bit, unfortunately, and I think there has been not enough emphasis on the the little research that we've been able to do on this disease compared to other major disease. There's I think somewhere in when you introduced this talk, you said there millions. We really don't know the actual prevalence of ME in the world, but I think it's possibly an underestimate to say that there's 10 million people with ME CFS. And when you think about it, we just get so little attention and so little funding. But what really, there are not many papers on family history. And I think that's an area that should be explored. I do see more commonly mother-daughter pairs, because it is more prevalent among women. And I know that sounds sexist, but it is the fact that about 70% of people with ME are women. And what I see not necessarily is a mirror image in the child if they do have something similar, but a variant, like maybe more POTS or migraine headaches, IBS, or fibro in the child. Doesn't have to be a child. It can also be another relative, but I know the question was specifically about a child. Could be an aunt or further down the tree. But I think, and if the child more often than not will exhibit more dysautonomia, migraine headaches, POTS-like symptoms, maybe gastro stuff, as opposed to full-blown fatigue is what I've seen. And I have encouraged, like Lynn said, you have to worry about not projecting your own symptoms, but if you truly feel that something is going on, you should have them evaluated right away. I don't see it super often, but I'd say at least a quarter to a third of the time that could be a possibility. And as I said, more often in the younger folks who get this, it's more of a dysautonomia type complaint as opposed to outright ME symptoms, at least early on.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Levine. So this next question is from someone with an ME diagnosis for the past 3 years, who's recently been diagnosed with gastroparesis, fibromyalgia, and hypermobile joint syndrome, also maybe Lyme disease. Similar to Jen, they've had neck and structural issues that could be EDS or something similar to CCI/AAI. I don't know what all these acronyms mean, so if you can maybe explain that in your answer, Dr. Levine, that would be great. And cervical cranial instability. There are so many issues and symptoms to balance. How do I choose what should be my priority as a patient over what's misidentification or misdiagnosis that maybe isn't reliable?
I'll try to answer that as best as I can. It's interesting. I mean, I hate to say it, but I think what draws me to being an ME doctor, or who did in the beginning, and keeps me interested, is it is really fascinating from a scientific point of view, all these different comorbid. I mean, I still can't get over why POTS would necessarily be associated with ME, but in any case, I think on the good side of the coin, the positive side is at least I feel that tackling some of these comorbidities, whether they help that much or not, like POTS, for instance, where there are at least a half a dozen different drugs that you can try on the person in the hopes of improving their fatigue. Mast cell, I don't know if I got them right, mast cell disorder, fibromyalgia. So there's, like, for at least those 3 or 4, there are things you can do to try to improve the person's well-being. ME, believe it or not, is still kind of elusive, and that's obviously our main topic here. CCI is relatively new among the grouping, and I'll tell you very briefly why. When you do just an ordinary MRI or kind of an imaging procedure of the neck on people, oftentimes it's read as normal. And unless you do it a specific way, some of the audience may be familiar with this, in static and flexed positions, you may not pick up that there's a tethered cord there. And it has to be read by there's only 2 neurosurgeons in the country, from what I understand, that know how to read these films. And you can imagine the huge waiting list these 2 neurosurgeons have to read these films. So the point is that it's not, even in people who may be willing to make the diagnosis, an easy diagnosis to make. And the treatments are scary, surgery and even traction may have its complications there. So that's what I would call a new and emerging diagnosis, the CCI one. But I think the idea is that what I try to do when I see people who have multiple comorbidities is I try to give them an idea, at least even in the first or second appointment, to start connecting with the different experts around the country, hopefully some of them closer to home than not, who can, target these different body systems while we're working on their ME/CFS. But I think at least the sort of positive aspect is that it gives us some targets for treatment.
All right, thank you. And I think this question is mostly for Lynn or MK, but how do you advocate for yourself or others effectively at the doctor?
Do you want to take one, MK?
Yeah, I'll try. It's been very challenging to deal with the medical community, and that's one of the reasons I was interested in talking on the panel, because I think you are the future healthcare professionals out there, some of you. I think, and Dr. Levine, I think you talked about this a bit too. I think what I've learned about doctors is a lot of them remind me of kind of car mechanics. So they really want to get in there, they want to see a problem, and they want to fix it. And it's very frustrating to them that they can't fix this. So, I think, and again, going back to this idea of having very limited energy, Dr. Levine, you talked about, if you're a patient who has so little energy that, literally washing up and getting dressed to leave the house takes a huge amount of energy, how do you get that person to a doctor? So,
We lost you, MK.
Whoops.
Is she gone? Do you want me to jump in?
I'm not sure if she's gone.
I don't see her picture.
Yeah.
Oh, there you are.
Well, I think you saw this with Jen Brea, where she tried a lot of different things. And I think when you're an adult and you can do that, but when you're the parent of a child, I think you need to be careful about the number of doctors that you try to go see. We worked with our pediatrician and we went through his recommendations and were very conservative about the number of doctors that we saw.
I can jump in just a little bit and say, really this is another area where someone who is well could help a person with ME. One of the things that David has really done, other than bringing a man to an appointment with you, if you're a woman, I'm sorry to say, has made a really big difference. So if you've got a man to bring along, similar to car mechanics actually. But one of the things that he helped me put together is basically a Google document that we update. We've got one with a timeline of my illness. We've got one with my current medications. We've got one with that's kind of a cover sheet of like, here's the highlights, here's the meds I'm on, here's the meds we've tried that didn't work, here's a list of doctors, and basically a mini medical record that we print off a copy and hand it to the doctor when we go to someone, and it every time, even if it's someone we've been to before. And that really helps, because if someone says to me, tell me your medical history, I'm like, so having something like that is really, really helpful. And also, I think limiting the number of questions that you want to ask each time you go to the doctor. You know, kind of having an idea of what you want to accomplish, because when I've gone to specialists in the past and basically just put myself at their mercy, if they're not an ME specialist, I don't know, it's really hit or miss. So trying to focus, and maybe if you have a GP or someone who can help oversee that, great, but that's, you know, that's not something that I've really had. And so we sort of function as my own doctor in a way, trying to manage all of those specialists and figure out what each one is going to give to us.
Thank you. So on to our last question for today. So this is a question by Danielle. For Lynn or caregivers of those with ME, what have you learned about yourself since the diagnoses? For example, have you discovered strengths or weaknesses within yourself as a person? And was it challenging to overcome a specific weakness?
I don't know, no one else is talking, so I guess that's on me. I mean, I'm certainly stronger than I thought. I have a lot more value than I thought. And, you know, this goes back to whether I'm offering something to the economy or whatever. I really didn't think I prescribed to that. And I guess I did. It was sort of deeply in me. And I have inherent value. And that is something that that Emmy helped me learn. Yeah.
And I'll add to that too. For me, I'm a planner, and I think a lot about the future. And when an illness comes along like this, that is completely
MK, we lost you. I think you're back. We lost you briefly. Maybe try turning off your video and see if just audio will work better.
Okay. I'm a planner, and so what I learned from an illness like this that you can't predict and that you can't plan, I learned, to live very much in the moment and to focus on now, and to really appreciate and savor the joy of the moment.
I think that's a great one, MK. And if I could jump in, actually, something I wanted to mention that this really ties well into is that a book that really helped me is called How to Be Sick. And the author is escaping me. I'm trying to look at my bookshelf to see if it's there, and I don't see it. But it's basically sort of Buddhism light for sick people. And it was written by someone with ME, but it's really relevant to basically any chronic illness. And it's a lot about being in this moment and acceptance and not being able to plan and all of that. So for people who want to explore those concepts deeper, it's a great book for that.
So it's almost 4:45. And I want to be respectful of everyone's time and energy. So there's still a lot of questions left unanswered, but unfortunately, I think we're going to have to leave the remaining questions unanswered. I really want to, first of all, thank our panelists, Dr. Levine, Lynn, and MK, for bringing your expertise and your time and energy for this panel. I've certainly really enjoyed hearing all the answers and have found this to be a very, very interesting discussion. So thank you, all of you. I want to thank my students who have helped organize and keep this running as we've been sort of communicating, texting through back channels to keep things moving along smoothly. It's really been a wonderful experience. So thanks to all of you. And thanks to everyone who attended to listen and be part of this today. I want to end with one sort of last note, which is, in thinking about, since there were a lot of questions about advocacy and helping people with ME and things like that. May 12th is Millions Missing, which is the advocacy event that is featured in Unrest, and it's going to be, of course, entirely online this year. There's always an online component, of course, being part of the ME community. That's there's always a strong online presence. But this year it's entirely online. If you want details about participating in Millions Missing this year, you can go to the ME Action website, which is meaction.net, and that's on May 12th. As we mentioned, this is recorded, so we will, once it's ready, we'll let everyone know how to access it, and that is something that you can share with others as well. So thanks again to everyone, and have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you.